The baby had been unexpected. Melissa had never expected that such a short affair would yield a child, but as she stood alone in the cramped bathroom, nervous anticipation fluttering behind her ribs, the result on the pregnancy test was undeniable. Positive. Her first reaction was shock, followed immediately by despair. A large sinking hole in her stomach that swallowed up any possible joy she might have otherwise felt about carrying a child in her womb. A child. She couldn't raise a child. Not by herself in her small, squalid apartment and job as a grocery store clerk. She didn't have the means to bring up a baby. It wasn't the right environment for a newborn. The drooping tap in the kitchen, the fettering cobwebs that she hadn't found the time to brush away. This wasn't something she'd be able to handle alone, but she thought of getting rid of it instead. In a panicked daze, Melissa reached for her phone. Her fingers fumbled as she dialed his number. The baby's father, Albert. They had met by chance one night, under a beautiful, twinkling sky that stirred her desires more favorably than normal. Melissa wasn't one to engage in such affairs normally, but that night she had, almost as if swayed by the romantic glow of the moon itself. She thought she would be safe, protected, but against the odds, her body had chosen to carry a child instead, something she could have never expected. It was only the sudden morning nausea and feeling that something was different that prompted her to visit the pharmacy and purchase a pregnancy test. She thought she was just being silly, letting her mind get carried away with things, but that hadn't been the case at all. As soon as she heard Albert's voice on the other end of the phone, quiet and short, in an impatient sort of way, she hesitated. Did she really expect him to care? He must have meant nothing to him, a minor attraction that had already fizzled away like an ember in the night. Why would he care about a child born from an accident? She almost hung up without speaking.
Hello?
Albert said again. You could hear the frown in his voice.
Albert?
She finally said, her voice low, tenuous. One hand rested on her stomach, still flat, hiding the days-old fetus that had already started growing within her.
It's Melissa.
His tone changed immediately, becoming gentler.
Melissa, I was wondering why the number was unrecognized. I only gave you mine, didn't I?
There's something I need to tell you.
The line went quiet, only a flutter of anticipated breath. Melissa wondered if he already knew. Would he hang up the moment the words slipped out and block her number so that she could never contact him again? She braced herself.
I'm pregnant.
The silence stretched for another beat, followed by a short gasp of realization.
Pregnant?
He echoed. He sounded breathless.
That's wonderful news.
Melissa released the breath she'd been holding, strands of honey-colored hair falling across her face.
It is?
Of course it is,
Albert said with a cheery laugh.
I was rather hoping this might be the case.
Melissa clutched the phone tighter. Her eyes widened as she stared down at her feet. His reaction was not what she'd been expecting. Was he really pleased?
You were?
Indeed.
Melissa covered her mouth with her hand, shaking her head.
But I can't.
If it's money you're worried about, there's no need,
Albert assured her.
In fact, I have the perfect proposal.
A faint frown tugged at Melissa's brows, something about how words sounded rehearsed somehow, as if he really had been anticipating this news.
You will leave your home and come live with me in Duskvale. I'll provide everything. I'm sure you'll settle here quite nicely. You and our child.
Melissa swallowed, starting to feel dizzy.
Live with you?
He repeated, leaning heavily against the cold bathroom tiles. Maybe she should sit down. All of this news was almost too much for her to grasp.
Yes, would that be a problem?
I suppose not,
Melissa said. Albert was a sweet and charming man, and the short affair had left her feeling far from regretful, but weren't things moving a little too quickly? She didn't know anything about Duskvale, the town he was from, and it almost felt like he had all of this planned from the start, but that was impossible.
Perfect.
Albert continued, unaware of Melissa's lingering uncertainty.
Then I'll make arrangements at once. This child will have a bright future ahead of it, I'm sure.
He hung up and a heavy silence fell across Melissa's shoulders. Moved to Duskvale? Live with Albert? Was this really the best choice? But as she gazed around her small, cramped bathroom and the dim hallway beyond, maybe this was her chance for a new start. Albert was a kind man, and she knew he had money. If he was willing to care for her, just until she had her child and figured something else out, then wouldn't she be a fool to squander such an opportunity? If anything, she would do it for the baby, to give it the best start in life she possibly could. A few weeks later, Melissa packed up her life and relocated to the small, mysterious town of Duskvale. Despite the almost gloomy atmosphere that seemed to pervade the town from the dark, shingled buildings and the tall, curious-looking crypt in the middle of the cemetery, the people that lived there were more than friendly. Melissa was almost taken aback by how well they received her, treating her not as a stranger, but as an old friend. Albert's house was a grand, old-fashioned manor with dark stone bricks choked with ivy, but there was also a sprawling, well-maintained garden and a beautiful terrace. As she dropped off her bags at the entryway and swept through the rooms, most of them laying untouched and unused in the absence of a family, she thought this would be the perfect place to raise a child. For the moment, it felt too quiet, too empty, but soon it would be filled with joy and laughter once the baby was born. The first few months of Melissa's pregnancy passed smoothly. Her bump grew, becoming more and more visible beneath the loose, flowery clothing she wore, and the news of the child she'd carried was well received by the townsfolk. Almost everyone seemed excited about her pregnancy, congratulating her and eagerly anticipating when the child would be due. They seemed to show a particular interest in the gender of the child, though Melissa herself had yet to find out. Living in Duskvale with Albert was like a dream for her. Albert cared for her every need, entertained her every whim. She was free to relax and potter and often spent her time walking around town and visiting the lake behind his house. She would spend hours sitting on the small wooden bench and watching fish swim through the crystal clear water, the birds landing amongst the reeds and pecking at the bugs on the surface. Sometimes she brought crumbs and seeds with her and tried to coax the sparrows and finches closer, but they always kept their distance. The neighbors were extremely welcoming too, often bringing her fresh bread and baked treats, urging her to keep up her strength and stamina for the labor that awaited her. One thing she did notice about the town, which struck her as odd, was the people that lived there. There was a disproportionate number of men and boys compared to the women. She wasn't sure she'd ever seen a female child walking amongst a group of school children that often passed by the front of the house. Perhaps the school was an all-boys institution, but even the local park seemed devoid of any young girls whenever she walked by. The women that she spoke to seemed to have come from out of town too, relocating here to live with their husbands. Not a single woman was actually born in Duskvale. While Melissa thought it strange, she tried not to think too deeply about it. Perhaps it was simply a coincidence that boys were born more often than girls around here. Or perhaps there weren't enough opportunities here for women, and most of them left town as soon as they were old enough. She never thought to inquire about it, worried people might find her questions strange and disturb the pleasant, peaceful life she was building for herself there. After all, everyone was so nice to her. Why would she want to ruin it just because of some minor concerns about the gender disparity? The women seemed happy with their lives in Duskvale after all. There was no need for any concern. So she pushed aside her worries and continued counting the days until her due date, watching as her belly slowly grew larger and larger to accommodate the growing fetus inside. One evening, Albert came home from work and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his hands on her bump. "I think it's finally time to find out the gender," he told her, his eyes twinkling. Melissa was thrilled to finally know if she was having a baby girl or boy, and a few days later, Albert had arranged for an appointment with the local obstetrician, Dr. Edwards. He was a stout man with a wiry gray mustache and busy eyebrows, but he was kind enough, even if he did have an odd air about him. Albert stayed by her side while blood was drawn from her arm, and she was prepared for an ultrasound. Although she was excited, Melissa couldn't quell the faint flicker of apprehension in her stomach at Albert's unusually grave expression. The gender of the child seemed to be of importance to him, though Melissa knew she would be happy no matter what sex her baby turned out to be. The gel that was applied to her stomach was cold and unpleasant. She focused on the warmth of Albert's hand gripping hers as Dr. Edwards moved the probe over her belly. She felt the baby kick a little in response to the pressure, and her heart fluttered. The doctor's face was unreadable as he stared at the monitor, displaying the results of the ultrasound. Melissa allowed her gaze to follow his, her chest warming at the image of her unborn baby on the screen, even in shades of gray and white. It looked so perfect, the child she was carrying in her own womb. Albert's face was calm, though Melissa saw the faint strain at his lips. Was he just as excited as her, or was he nervous? They hadn't discussed the gender before, but if Albert had a preference, she didn't want it to cause any contention between them if it turned out the baby wasn't what he was hoping for. Finally, Dr. Edwards put down the probe and turned to face them. His voice was light, his expression unchanged. "It's a girl," he said simply. Melissa choked out a cry of happiness, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. She was carrying a baby girl. She turned to Albert. Something unreadable flickered across his face, but it was already gone before she could decipher it. "A girl," he said, smiling down at her. "How lovely."
Isn't it?
Melissa agreed, squeezing Albert's hand even tighter, unable to suppress her joy.
I can't wait to meet her already.
Dr. Edwards cleared his throat as he began mopping up the excess gel on Melissa's stomach. He wore a slight frown. "I assume you'll be opting for a natural birth, yes?" Melissa glanced at him, her smile fading as she blinked.
What do you mean?
Albert shuffled beside her, silent. "Some women prefer to go down the route of a Carcerian section," he explained nonchalantly. "But in this case, I would highly recommend avoiding that if possible. Natural births are always best." He turned away, his shoes squeaking against the shiny linoleum floor.
Oh, I see.
Melissa muttered.
Well, if that's what you recommend, I suppose I'll listen to your advice. I hadn't given it much thought, really.
The doctor exchanged a brief, almost unnoticeable glance with Albert. He cleared his throat again. "Your due date is in less than a month, yes? Make sure you get plenty of rest and prepare yourself for the labor." He took off his latex gloves and tossed them in the bin, signaling the appointment was over. Melissa nodded, still mulling over his words.
Okay, I will. Thank you for your help, Doctor."
Albert helped her off the medical examination table, cupping her elbow with his hands to steady her as she wobbled on her feet. The smell of the gel and Dr. Edwards' strange remarks were making her feel a little disoriented, and she was relieved when they left his office and stepped out into the fresh air.
"A girl,"
she finally said, smiling up at Albert. "Yes," he said, "a girl." The news that Melissa was expecting a girl spread through the town fairly quickly, threading through whispers and gossip. The reactions she received were varied. Most of the men seemed pleased for her, but some of the folk, the older, quieter ones who normally stayed out of the way, showed expressions of sympathy that Melissa didn't quite understand. She found it odd, but not enough to question. People were allowed to have their own opinions after all. Even if others weren't pleased, she was ecstatic to welcome a baby girl into the world. Left alone at home while Albert worked, she often found herself gazing out of the upstairs windows, daydreaming about her little girl growing up on these grounds, running through the grass with pigtails and a toothy grin, and feeding the fish in the pond. She had never planned on becoming a mother, and now that it had come to be, she couldn't imagine anything else. Until she remembered the disconcerting lack of young girls in town, and a strange, unsettling sort of dread would spread through her as she found herself wondering, why? Did it have something to do with everyone's interest in the child's gender? But for the most part, the people around here seemed normal, and Albert hadn't expressed any concerns that it was a girl. If there was anything to worry about, he would surely tell her. So Melissa went on daydreaming as the days passed, bringing her closer and closer to the due date. And then finally, early one morning towards the end of the month, the first contraction hit her. She awoke to pain tightening in her stomach and a startling realization of what was happening. Frantically switching on the bedside lamp, she shook Albert awake, grimacing as she tried to get the words out.
"I think the baby's coming."
He drove her immediately to Dr. Edwards' surgery, who was already waiting to deliver the baby. Pushed into a wheelchair, she was taken to an empty surgery room and helped into a medical gown by two smiling midwives. The contractions grew more frequent and painful, and she gritted her teeth as she coaxed herself through each one. The bed she was laying on was hard, and the strip of fluorescent lights above her were too bright, making her eyes water, and the constant beep of the heart rate monitor beside her was making her head spin. How was she supposed to give birth like this? She could hardly keep her mind straight. One of the midwives came in with a large needle, still smiling. The sight of it made Melissa clench up in fear.
"This might sting a bit,"
she said. Melissa hissed through her teeth as the needle went into her spine, crying out in pain, subconsciously reaching for Albert, but he was no longer there. Her eyes skipped around the room, empty except for the midwife. Where had he gone? Was he not going to stay with her through the birth? The door opened and Dr. Edwards walked in, donning a plastic apron and gloves. Even behind the surgical mask he wore, Melissa could tell he was smiling. "It's time," was all he said. The birth was difficult and laborious. Melissa's vision blurred with sweat and tears as she did everything she could to push the Dr. Edwards' command. Yes, natural is always best," he muttered. Melissa, with a groan, asked him what he meant by that. He stared at her like it was a silly question. "Because sometimes it happens so fast that there's a risk of it falling back inside the open incision. That makes things tricky for all involved. Wouldn't you agree?" Melissa still didn't know what he meant, but another contraction hit her hard, and she struggled through the pain with a cry, her hair plastered to her skull and her cheeks damp and sticky with tears. Finally, with one final push, she felt the baby slide out. The silence that followed was deafening. Wasn't the baby supposed to cry? Dr. Edwards picked up the baby and wrapped it in a white towel. She knew in her heart that something wasn't right. "Quick," the doctor said, his voice urgent and his expression grim as he thrust the baby towards her. "Look attentively, burn her image into your memory. It'll be the only chance you get." Melissa didn't know what he meant. Only chance? What was he talking about? Why wasn't her baby crying? What was wrong with her? She gazed at the bundle in his arms, the perfect round face and button-sized nose, the mottled pink skin covered in blood and pieces of glistening placenta, the closed eyes. The baby wasn't moving. It sat still and silent in his arms, like a doll. Her heart ached, her whole body began to tremble. Surely not. But as she looked closer, she thought she saw the baby's chest moving, just a little. With a soft cry, Melissa reached forward, her fingers barely brushing the air around her baby's cheek. And then she turned to ash. Without warning, the baby in Dr. Edwards' arms crumbled away, skin and flesh completely disintegrating until there was nothing but a pile of dust cradled in the middle of his palm. Melissa began to scream. The midwife returned with another needle. This one went into her arm, injecting a strong sedative into her bloodstream as Melissa's screams echoed throughout the entire surgery. They didn't stop until she lost consciousness completely, and the delivery room finally went silent once more. The room was dark when Melissa woke up. Still groggy from the sedative, she could hardly remember if she'd already given birth. Subconsciously, she felt for her bump. Her stomach was flatter than before.
My baby,"
She groaned weakly. Hush now. A figure emerged from the shadows beside her, and a lamp switched on, spreading a meager glow across the room, leaving the shadows hovering around the edges. Albert stood beside her. He reached out and gently touched her forehead, his hands cool against her warm skin. In the distance, she heard the rapid beep of a monitor, the squeaking wheels of a gurney being pushed down a corridor, the muffled sound of voices. But inside her room, everything was quiet. She turned her head to look at Albert, her eyes sore and heavy. Her body felt strange, like it wasn't her own.
"My baby, where is she?"
Albert dragged a chair over to the side of her bed and sat down with a heavy sigh. "She's gone." Melissa started crying, tears spilling rapidly down her cheeks.
What do you mean by gone? Where's my baby?"
Albert looked away, his gaze tracing shadows along the walls. "It's this town. It's cursed," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Melissa's heart dropped into her stomach. She knew she should have listened to those warnings at the back of her mind. Why were there no girls here? But she trusted Albert wouldn't bring her here if there was danger involved, and now he was telling her the town was cursed?
"I don't understand,"
she cried, her hands reaching for her stomach again. She felt broken, like a part of her was missing.
"I just want my baby. Can you bring her back? Please, give me back my baby.
Melissa, listen to me. Albert urged, but she was still crying and rubbing at her stomach, barely paying attention to his words. Centuries ago, this town was plagued by witches. Horrible, wicked witches who used to burn male children as sacrifices for their twisted rituals. Melissa groaned quietly, her eyes growing unfocused as she looked around the room, searching for her lost child. Albert continued speaking, doubtful she was even listening. The witches were executed for their crimes, but the women who live in Duskvale continue to pay the price for their sins. Every time a child is born in this town, one of two outcomes can happen. Male babies are spared and live as normal. But when a girl is born, very soon after birth, they turn completely to ash. That's what happened to your child. These days, the only descendants that remain from the town's first settlers are male. Any female children born from their blood turn to ash. Melissa's expression twisted, and she sobbed quietly in her hospital bed.
My baby.
I know it's difficult to believe. Albert continued with a sigh, resting his chin on his hands. But we've all seen it happen. Babies turning to ash within moments of being born, with no apparent cause. Why should we doubt what the stories say when such things really do happen? His gaze trailed hesitantly towards Melissa, but her eyes were elsewhere. The sheets around her neck were already soaked with tears. That's not all, he went on. Our town is governed by what we call the patriarchy. Only a few men in each generation are selected to be part of the elite group. Sadly, I was not one of the chosen ones. As the stories get lost, it's becoming progressively difficult to find reliable and trustworthy members amongst the newer generations. Or, at least, that's what I've heard. He added with an air of bitterness. Melissa's expression remained blank. Her cries had fallen quiet now, only silent tears dripping down her cheeks. Albert might have thought she'd fallen asleep, but her eyes were still open, staring dully at the ceiling. He doubted she was absorbing much of what he was saying, but he hoped she understood enough that she wouldn't resent him for keeping such secrets from her. This is just the way it had to be. I hope you can forgive me, but as a descendant of the Duskvale lineage, I had no choice. This is the only way we could break the curse. Melissa finally stirred. She murmured something in a soft, unintelligible whisper before sinking deeper into the covers and closing her eyes. She might have said, "My baby." She might have said something else. Her voice was too quiet, too weak to properly enunciate her words. Albert stood from her bedside with another sigh. "You get some rest," he said, gently touching her forehead again. She leaned away from his touch, turning over so that she was no longer facing him. "I'll come back shortly. There's something I must do first." Receiving no further response, Albert slipped out of her hospital room and closed the door quietly behind him. He took a moment to compose himself, fixing his expression into his usual, calm, collected smile, then went in search of Dr. Edwards. The doctor was in his office further down the corridor, poring over some documents on his desk. He looked up when Albert stood in the doorway and knocked. I take it you're here for the ashes." He plucked his reading glasses off his nose and stood up. "That's right." Dr. Edwards reached for a small ceramic pot sitting on the table, passed him, and pressed it into Albert's hands. "Here you go. I'll keep an eye on Melissa while you're gone. She's in safe hands." Albert made a non-committal murmur, tucking the ceramic pot into his arms as he left Dr. Edwards' office and walked out of the surgery. It was already late in the evening, and the setting sun had painted the sky red, dusting the rooftops with a deep, ember glow. He walked through town on foot, the breeze tugging at the edges of his dark hair as he kept his gaze on the rising spire of the building in the middle of the cemetery. He had told Melissa initially that it was a crypt for some sort of the town's forebears, but in reality, it was much more than that. It was a temple. He clasped the pot of ashes firmly in his hands as he walked towards it, the sun gradually sinking behind the rooftops and bruising the edges of the sky with dusk. The people he passed on the street cast looks of understanding and sympathy when they noticed the pot in his hand. Some of them had gone through this ritual already themselves and knew the conflicting emotions that accompanied such a duty. It was almost fully dark by the time he reached the temple. It was the town's most sacred place, and he paused at the doorway to take a deep breath, steadying his body and mind before finally stepping inside. It smelled exactly like one would expect for an old building, mildewy and stale, like the air inside him had not been exposed to a starlight in a long while. It was dark too, the wide chamber lit only by a handful of flame-bearing torches that sent shadows dancing around Albert's feet. His footsteps echoed on the stone floor as he walked towards the large stone basin in the middle of the temple. His breath barely stirred the cold, untouched air. He paused at the circular construction and held the pot aloft. A mountain of ashes lay before him. In the darkness, it looked like a puddle of the darkest ink. According to the stories and common belief passed down through the generations, the curse that had been placed on Duskvale would only cease to exist once enough ashes had been collected to pay off the debts of the past. As was customary, Albert held the pot of his child's ashes and apologized for using Melissa for the needs of his people. Although it was cruel on the women to use them in this way, they were needed as vessels to carry the children that would either prolong their generation or erase the sins of the past. If she had brought them to term a baby boy, things would have ended up much differently. He would have raised it with Melissa as his son, passing on his blood to the next generation. But since it was a girl she had given birth to, this was the way it had to be, the way the curse demanded it to be. Every man has to fulfill his obligation to preserve the lineage. Albert spoke aloud before tipping the pot into the basin and watching the baby's ashes trickle into the shadows. It was the dead of night when 7 men approached the table. Their bodies were clothed in dark, ritualistic robes, and they walked through the cemetery, guided by nothing but the pale sickle of the moon. One by one, they stepped across the threshold of the temple, their sandaled feet barely making a whisper on the stone floor. They walked past the circular basin of ashes in the middle of the chamber, towards the plain stone wall on the other side. Clustered around it, one of the men, the elder, reached for one of the gray stones, perfectly blending into the rest of the dark, mottled wall. The brick would have looked unassuming to anyone else, but as his fingers touched the rough surface, it drew inwards with a soft click. With a low rumble, the entire wall began to shift, stones pulling away in a jagged jigsaw and rotating round until the wall was replaced by a deep alcove in which sat a large statue carved from the same dark stone as the basin behind them. The statue portrayed a godlike deity with an eyeless face and gaping mouth, and 5 hands crisscrossing over its chest. A sea of stone tentacles cocooned the bottom half of the bust, obscuring its lower body. With the eyeless statue gazing down at them, the 7 men returned to the basin of ashes in the middle of the room, where they held their hands out in offering. The elder began to speak, his voice low in reverence. He bowed his head, the hood of his robe casting shadows across his old, wrinkled face.
"We present these ashes, taken from many brief lives, and offer them to you, O Mighty One, in exchange for your favor."
Silence threaded through the temple, unbroken by even a single breath. Even the flames from the torches seemed to fall still, no longer flickering in the draught seeping through the stone walls. Then the elder reached into his robes and withdrew a pile of crumpled papers. On each sheaf of parchment was the name of a man and a number handwritten in glossy, black ink that almost looked red in the torchlight. The soft crinkle of papers interrupted the silence as he took the first one from the pile and placed it down carefully onto the pile of ashes within the basin. Around him in a circle, the other men began to chant, their voices unifying in a low, dissonant hum that spread through the shadows of the temple and curled against the dark, tapered ceiling above them. As their voices rose and fell, the pile of ashes began to move, as if something was clawing its way out from beneath them. A hand appeared, pale fingers reached up through the ashes, prodding the air as if searching for something to grasp onto. An arm followed shortly, followed by a crown of dark hair. Gradually, the figure managed to drag itself out of the ashes. A man, naked and dazed, stared at the circle of robed men around him. One of them stepped forward to offer a hand, helping the man climb out of the basin and step out onto the cold stone floor. Ushering the naked man to the side, the elder plucked another piece of paper from the pile and placed it on the top of the basin once again. There were less ashes than before. Once again, the pile began to tremble and shift, sliding against the stone rim as another figure emerged from within. Another man, older this time, with a creased forehead and graying hair. The number on his paper read 58. One by one, the robed elder placed the pieces of paper onto the piles of ashes, with each name and number corresponding to the age and identity of one of the men rising out of the basin. With each man that was summoned, the ashes inside the basin slowly diminished, the price that had to be paid for their rebirth. The cost changed with each one, depending on how many times they had been brought back before. Eventually, the naked men outnumbered those dressed in robes, ranging from old to young, all standing around in silent confusion and innate reverence for the mysterious stone deity watching them from the shadows. With all of the papers submitted, the patriarchy was now complete once more. Even the founder, who had died for the first time centuries ago, had been reborn again from the ashes of those innocent lives. Contrary to common belief, the curse that had been cast upon Duskvale all those years ago had in fact been his doing. After spending years dabbling in the dark arts, it was his actions that had created this basin of ashes, the receptacle which he would arise again and again, forever immortal, so long as the flesh of innocence continued to be offered up upon the deity that now gazed down upon them.
We have returned to mortal flesh once more.
The patriarch spoke, spreading his arms wide as the torchlight glinted off his naked body.
Now let us embrace this glorious night against our new skin.
Following their reborn leader, the members of the patriarchy crossed the chamber towards the temple doors, the eyeless statues watching them to the shadows. As the patriarch reached for the ornate golden handle, the large wooden door shuddered but did not open. He tried again, a scowl furrowing between his brows.
What is the meaning of this?
He snapped. The elder hurriedly stepped forward in confusion, his head bowed.
What is it, master?
The door will not open. The elder reached for the door himself, pushing and pulling on the handle, but the patriarch was right. It remained tightly shut, as though it had been locked from the outside.
How could this be?
He muttered, glancing around. His gaze picked over the confused faces around him, and that's when he finally noticed. Only 6 robed men remained, including himself. One of them must have slipped out unnoticed while they had been preoccupied by the ritual. Did that mean they had a traitor amongst them? But what reason would he have for leaving and locking them inside the temple?
What's going on?
The patriarch demanded, the impatience in his voice echoing through the chamber. The elder's expression twisted into a grimace.
I don't know.
Outside the temple, the traitor of the patriarchy stood amongst the assembled townsfolk. Both men and women were present, standing in a semicircle around the locked temple. The key dangled from the traitor's hand. He had already informed the people of the truth, that the ashes of the innocent were in fact an offering to bring back the deceased members of the original patriarchy, including the patriarch himself. It was not a curse brought upon them by the sins of witches, but in fact a tragic fate born from one man's selfish desire to dabble in the dark arts. And now that the people of Duskvale knew the truth, they had arrived at the temple for retribution, one they would wreak with their own hands. Amongst the crowd was Melissa, still mourning the recent loss of her baby. Her despair had twisted into pure, unfettered anger once she had found out the truth. It was not some unforgiving curse of the past that had stolen away her child, but the patriarchy themselves. In her hand she held a carton of gasoline. Many others in the crowd had similar receptacles of liquid, while others carried burning torches that blazed bright beneath the midnight sky.
There will be no more coming back from the dead, you bastards.
One of the women screamed as she began splashing gasoline up the temple walls, watching it soak into the dark stone. With rallying cries, the rest of the crowd following her demonstration, dousing the entire temple in the oily, flammable liquid. The pungent, acrid smell of the gasoline filled the air, making Melissa's eyes water as she emptied out her carton and tossed it aside. stepping back. Once every inch of the stone was covered, those bearing torches stepped forward and tossed the burning flames onto the temple. The fire caught immediately, lapping up the fuel as it consumed the temple in vicious, ravenous flames. The dark stone began to crack as the fire seeped inside, filling the air with low, creaking groans and splintering rock, followed by the unearthly screams of the men trapped inside. The town residents stepped back, their faces grim in the firelight, as they watched the flames ravage the temple and all that remained within. Melissa's heart wrenched at the sound of the agonizing screams, mixed with what almost sounded like the eerie, distant cries of a baby. She held her hands against her chest, watching solemnly as the structure began to collapse. Thick chunks of stone breaking away and smashing against the ground, scattering across the graveyard. The sky was almost completely covered by thick columns of black smoke, blotting out the moon and the stars and filling the night with bright, amber flames instead. Melissa thought she saw dark, blackened figures sprawled amongst the ruins, but it was too difficult to see between the smoke. A hush fell across the crowd as the screams from within the temple finally fell quiet. In front of them, the structure continued to smolder and burn, more and more pieces of stone tumbling out of the smoke and filling the ground with burning debris. As the temple completely collapsed, I finally felt the night air upon my skin, hot and sulfuric. For there, amongst the debris, carbonized corpses and smoke, I rose from the ashes of a long slumber. I crawled out of the ruins of the temple, towering over the highest rooftops of Duskvale. Just like my statue, my eyeless face gazed down at the shocked residents below. The fire licked at my coiling tentacles, creeping around my body as if seeking to devour me too, but it could not. With a sweep of my 5 hands, I dampened the fire until it extinguished completely, opening my maw into a large, grimacing yawn. For centuries I had been slumbering beneath the temple, feeding on the ashes offered to me by those wrinkled old men in robes, feeding on their earthly desires and the debris of innocence, fulfilling my part of the favor. I had not expected to see the temple or the patriarchy fall under the hands of the common folk, but I was intrigued to see what this change might bring about. Far below me, the residents of Duskvale gazed back with reverence and fear, cowering like pathetic ants. None of them had been expecting to see me in the flesh, risen from the ruins of the temple. Not even the traitor of the patriarchs had ever lain eyes upon my true form. Only that paltry stone statue that had been built in my honor, yet failed to capture even a fraction of my true size and power.
If you wish to change the way things are,
I began to speak, my voice rumbling across Duskvale like a rising tide.
propose to me a new deal.
A collective shudder passed through the crowd. Most could not even look at me, bowing their heads in both respect and fear. Silence spread between them. Perhaps my hopes for them had been too high after all. But then, a figure stepped forward, detaching slowly from the crowd to stand before me. A woman, the one known as Melissa. Her fear had been swallowed up by loss and determination, a desire for change born from the tragedy she had suffered, the baby she had lost.
I have a proposal.
She spoke, trying to hide the quiver in her voice.
Then speak, mortal. What is your wish? A role reversal, to reduce males to ash upon their birth instead.
The woman, Melissa, shook her head, her clenched fist hung by her side.
Such vengeance is too soft on those who have wronged us,
She said. I could taste the anger in her words, as acrid as the smoke in the air. Fury swept through her blood like a burning fire. I listened with a smile to that which she proposed. The price for the new ritual was now 2 lives instead of 1. The father's life right after insemination, and the baby's life upon birth. The gender of the child was insignificant. The woman no longer needed progeny. Instead, the child would be born mummified, rejuvenating the body from which it was delivered. And thus, the vampiric widows of Duskvale would live forevermore. What a interesting story. There is a little bit of art involved in this one, so the artist name will be in the video placeholder as well, and everything will be linked in the description if you want to read or see the original post. I'm going to try to put the art on the screen when it shows up, which is I think at the beginning and near the end there. The art is pretty good, honestly, so yeah, really well drawn. It seems like sort of in the pencil sketch medium. It sort of looks digital though, but it is pretty impressive. The story ended pretty interesting. I'm not sure what that means. Were the women in charge the entire time? How did that go? But anyhow, that basically means that it's just a town of women now. If all the men are just gonna die, unless they're celibate. So yeah. Anyhow, I hope you enjoyed this story. It's pretty late and my brain's kind of mushy, so I'm gonna get to bed. And sorry that I don't have any more thoughts, but yeah, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you for all the support on Summer Sky. I really liked that one. It didn't do as well as I hoped, but it did really well. So thank you all for listening to that one. I know it's been like a week or two since that one came out because I record these a little bit in advance. I edit them in advance, so just in the case that I have an emergency and I'm unable to record for a day or something, so that there's never a missed day. But yeah, thank you all so much for listening. I will be reading the rest of the sister story later this week and editing that, so that should also come out on Thursday. Yeah, so this should be on Monday, and then the part 2 of the sister story will be out on Thursday, and I think like maybe the week after that, maybe next week I'll go ahead and post the 2-part full story. So if you don't want to listen to part 2 and wait for the full entire story to come out, that's absolutely totally okay and cool. So yeah, thank you all so much for listening. I'm saying for the 3rd time, I will see you in the next one. Ego Volt Anima Vestra.